Hello, we're live. Welcome everyone to the Rec Hangout, our March edition. Welcome back. Thank you very much for joining us. My name's Lou, welcome from Colleague Software. The Rec Hangout is supported as always by Smart Recruit Online, and Mark's here to support us and to joining. We've got Louise Triance in the background as always, looking at Twitter, hashtag Rec Hangout, and all three of our guests are on Twitter as well, so please look them up and we'll share with you their Twitter handles after this as well. And of course, Alan Whitford as our host, AbTech Partnership, is here to host and ask the questions and lead the way. Today we're discussing people analytics, talent analytics, and recruitment analytics, and transforming your performance. And we're very pleased to have with us three superb guests who've taken time out, so thank you very much, chaps. We've got Anthony Scarpino from Sodexo, USA, all the way from just half an hour outside Boston, I think. He's the Senior Director of Talent Acquisition there. Thank you for joining, Anthony. We've got Ian Bailie as well, Global Head and Director of Talent Acquisition and People Planning Operations Team at Cisco. That's a mouthful. Thank you, Ian, for joining. And we've got David Green, and David is the co-chair and host of the 2016 People Analytics Conference, which they've kindly are supporting the show today. But David's day-to-day job, he's Global Director, People Analytics Solutions at IBM. So some fantastic names on the show. Just to thank People Analytics Conference for joining us. Their conference is on the 27th, 28th of April in London, and there is actually a £200 discount for those who have registered to watch the show today, and the promotional code has been sent out via MailChimp to everyone who signed up. If you've missed that, just let me know, and I'll also put it on the Webinar Jam chat. If you want to join in today, you've got the Webinar Jam chat on your right. I'll just test that. Hello, everyone. So please ask your questions and comment, and be nice, please, as always. So I know you guys are. And then join us on Twitter as well, hashtag Rec Hangout, because we're cool like that, apparently. Alan, over to you, so you can ask some serious questions.
Thank you, Louis. And in case you didn't quite get that, that was Louis Welcome, who is our technical maven behind everything that keeps this thing working from Colleague Software. And Louis always forgets to introduce himself. Thank you, Louis, for getting us set up. Welcome, everybody. This should be a fun show. People analytics, metrics, measurement. It does seem a bit of an anathema to those who have been in recruitment for a long time. I can remember struggling to get people to actually just measure how many employees they actually had in the building, much less anything related to how they got there. So I'm looking forward to the show today. I'm going to kick it off with perhaps a bit of an intro from each individual, a little bit about what you do and what you think the difference is maybe between metrics and people analytics. Ian, as you're our longest suffering member here at the moment. It looks like you're kind of locked away in a closet. We'll let you go first.
Thanks, Alan. So, hey everyone, Ian Bailie. As Louis mentioned, I work at Cisco Systems and lead our operations group for talent acquisition and what we're calling people planning, which is basically workforce planning with a slightly nicer name. So in terms of kind of what I look at across my team, it really is everything around our systems, tools, program management, and then ultimately analytics. And so we'll measure that entire candidate journey for the individuals to come into the company, but then we're also looking across metrics around understanding headcount and how that relates to workforce planning, but then also not just looking at our internal workforce from that point of view, but also going out and looking at the external market and candidate supply. And so for me, to answer your question, Alan, I think the difference really between metrics and analytics, metrics I think are ways, calculations that we do on some of the different pieces of data that we have to start to draw conclusions and be able to measure ourselves against targets and benchmarks. The analytics piece is then what you do with that data, how you dig a bit deeper. It's the root cause analysis, and then ultimately it should lead to action and to conclusions that you can then make changes in the business and about how you do things.
All right, excellent, and good, solid example of the difference between having the data and what we're going to do with it. Just to go over to Anthony outside of Boston. Anthony, tell us a little bit about what it is that you do and what's your perspective on that side of the pond in terms of analytics and metrics.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, I'm one of the senior directors in talent acquisition for Sodexo. We recruit for a variety of different services. We make about 6,000 management hires a year, and it covers food service management, housekeeping management, facilities management, a variety of different services that we provide to our clients. And my role includes a recruitment operations role where we manage a recruitment team, as well as about half of my role is in our employment branding and marketing function. So the metrics that we look at, very similar to what Ian said, they cover, each part of the recruitment process and sort of the flow of the candidate and the effectiveness of our recruitment process and of our, recruiters, hiring managers, input into that process. And then on the employment branding side, a whole host of different metrics and measurements that we look at to sort of recruitment branding and sourcing outcomes. The effectiveness of different strategies that we're using on that side, and how the candidates are flowing through the process and how successful they are. And I have to agree with Ian on the difference between metrics and analytics, primarily because it's easy to agree with Ian, then I don't have to repeat it. But I'd also add to a little piece of that. I think the metrics are those measurements that you make on a daily, weekly, monthly, whatever it is basis. And I think turning it into the analytics is, as Ian said, is sort of what you do with it and how you interpret it. I also think it's a combination of the metrics. So you might follow 3, 4, 5 different metrics that are all related to one group of analytics. You put them together and how they all speak to each other, how they all sort of complement each other, and then lead you to a good decision or to a decision to move forward, I think is where it sort of bridges into the analytics.
Okay, excellent. I think you guys have both already thrown up some themes that we'll be addressing during the conversation today. And finally, David, I'll come over to you. You've been a busy guy the last few weeks. You had a conference out in Amsterdam. You were at HR Tech in London. You got the People Analytics in London again next month. People are starting to call you the analytics guy. So what's your view on that? What is this analytics thing then?
Well, I think that's very kind of people to call me that. I think chairing conferences is a damn sight easier than actually speaking at them, that's for sure. So my role at IBM is kind of twofold. One is kind of external advocacy of analytics within HR, i.e. why people should be doing it, how they can do it, and what they should do. Hence why I pop up at all the conferences, I guess. And then the second part is helping customers build solutions around analytics, which could be within a specific area of HR, or could be primarily looking at a certain business problem that they're looking to solve. So it might be, I don't know, how can we improve the productivity or performance of our salespeople or something like that. I agree with both Ian and Anthony on their definition. I guess in simple terms, metrics tell you what has happened. Analytics can tell you why something has happened and what you should do about it to make the outcome better. So I guess if you look at recruiting, metrics can tell you how many people you've hired, how quickly you've hired them, even what the satisfaction of the candidate and the hiring manager was during the process, how much it cost you. I think analytics can potentially tell you how, help inform how successful those hires have been once they've actually started in your business, and then how you can improve the process to try and hire better people moving forward. So that's kind of exactly what Ian and Anthony said.
All right, thank you, David. Guys, I think all three of you, right, you're on a similar page, which is why it's great to have you here. But I'm going to wind it back a little bit, because all of you are working for very, shall we say, advanced thinking organizations where you've been used to years of actually gathering data, of actually having those metrics in place. And so actually it's almost second nature for you to already move into analyzing that information you've got. But it seems to me a ton of the companies that I've worked with over the last few years, they're still struggling to figure out what are those basic metrics I should be implementing to begin with. We're still debating whether it's time to hire or time to fill. And do I use the old Saratoga Institute cost per hire, which included everything down to the lights in the building, or am I only calling my advertising? So it feels to me that there's a chunk of people over here that have actually been gathering metrics for quite a while and are ready to pile into now using the analytics side. And over here there's a bunch of people that are saying, well, I'm still not sure what to measure. How do we bring them into that journey so that they actually set in place a plan, know what it is that they should measure, and be able to have a platform then to start doing analytics? Anthony, you want to kick off on that first?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that, Alan. First, in terms of what you should measure, I think, so many companies are so different in the way they're organized, particularly the HR or the recruitment function, that a lot of times it's really specific to your company what makes sense. And I think the time to fill, time to hire example that you gave is a perfect example, depending on, who's responsible for what in a process and who's measuring that metric. Time to fill might make sense, time to hire might make sense, time to offer might make sense. We also follow, one of the metrics that we measure is time to slate, so the time that it takes for the recruiter to deliver the candidate slate to the hiring manager. So I do think, depending on how HR is organized and what is the operations responsibility in the process, what is the recruitment or HR responsibility in the process, what you measure may vary a great deal.
Okay, and Ian, how do I decide what to measure? Should it be the recruitment resourcing person? Should it be HR? You mentioned the fact that there might be some input into workforce analytics and workforce planning, which I think is great. I think you're like one of the 11 people that do that. Let recruitment get involved in that whole piece. How do you help decide what to measure?
Yeah, ultimately, I think you've got to start somewhere, right? And I think often it's the easiest thing for people to do is to start with what's easiest to measure, right? Where you have the data. And I think that's okay to start there, but I think you need to think about what story you're trying to tell and what it is that why you're measuring the data, right? So first of all, you've got to get your arms around your data. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you might need to clean it up a little bit and start understanding it. The great thing about recruitment is it's an incredibly measurable process, right? Out of everything in HR, it's probably one of the easiest areas to measure. So that's a great start. And so time to fill, time to hire, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. I think you've got to make your own definition. You can use all the benchmarks out there. You can look at all the different providers to get an idea of how to measure it. But I think you've just got to pick one of them that works for you, as Anthony was saying, it works for your company, and then stick to it, right? Consistently measure that week on week, month on month, quarter on quarter, whatever it might be. Start to understand the data, and then ideally assign a target, right? Drive for something. Say what you think goodness looks like once you understand the data, and then see how you're performing against that target. Are you going up? Are you going down? And start to understand why, right? And so, time's important. Cost is important. We started off there. More recently, we've got more into quality, hiring manager, and candidate satisfaction, some of those other areas. I think you need to be able to walk before you can run. And so just start measuring something that matters and that will help you, as we said earlier, around the difference between metrics and analytics, something that will help you then start to change behavior. If you can start to talk knowledgeably about the data, about why it's doing what it's doing, and then ultimately start to think about how to tweak things that will change the data and ultimately change the process for the better, then I think that's where you really start to turn the corner.
Thank you, Ian. And David, that sounds a little bit like the kind of transition between just sort of core recruitment metrics into some more HR measurements, and you've done some work on that side. Are there some of the more HR-ish stuff that we should be trying to pull back into this core data and core metrics before we get into the analysis?
Well, I think the first thing is that we should measure stuff that's important to the business. I think for too long HR has come up with their own metrics, which and then maybe slap themselves on the back when they've, improved the time to hire and everything else. And actually, when they go to people in the business, they don't really care. So you kind of need to turn it into a language that makes sense to the business. I suspect, which a lot of the time is dollars and cents. But I think, I again agree with Ian and Anthony. I've got the easy part going third here, I think, in some respects. But I think obviously you need to have a process where you're getting the right data into the systems. rubbish in, rubbish out, and all that. So, you know, the recruiters and other people involved in the process, as Ian said, it's a very process heavy. Process heavy is talent acquisition, so you can collect a lot of data, but you need to actually make sure that the people are putting in the data, so you can then conduct the analysis and measure the metrics. I think it's funny is the time cost per hire, time to hire, in whichever way you do it, and quality of hire. I guess that balance has to change depending on what talent you're hiring into the organization. I think if you're hiring salespeople, if you're hiring game changers, then arguably the cost per hire is far less important than actually getting the right person into the business. You mentioned Saratoga, Alan. You know that I think they say that the cost of hiring the wrong person is about 1.5 times salary. So if you're looking at a difference between, I don't know, $5,000 and $6,000 to hire, then that pales into insignificance if you get it wrong. So I think there is that balance sometimes, which, you know, and again, I think a lot of more immature TA functions do talk a lot about cost per hire. They're trying to drive it down by $100 per hire and stuff like that. I'm not sure how important that is in comparison to hiring the right people. So I think get those kind of things in place first, and then, as Ian said, you've got the data sets that you can actually start conducting the analysis on and start to improve some of these areas moving forward.
And I think you're right, that cost per hire can be pretty scary. I always used to say that if you look at a salesperson, the cost per hire is actually about 85% of their annual target. It takes time to find them, takes time to get them out rocking and rolling. By the time they're fully functional, we're already into third quarter, potentially. So I agree. Anthony, you had something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, actually, two things. One, if I don't know if there's a virtual gold star we can hand out during this process, but if we could, I'd give it to David for the comment about measuring items that are important to the business. I think that is hugely important, and you know, should be underlined and asterisked. The other thing that I wanted to add to the comment is just that for an organization that's trying to figure out what to measure, or maybe how much to measure, is really caution people to not, you don't need a million metrics. You don't need to measure everything. Really, the important thing is once you start to measure something is, can you take the time to analyze it, make decisions by it, and then take actions by it. A lot of times I think we start by measuring so many things that you spend your whole time processing those numbers and looking at those numbers, and by the time you've got them all together at the end of the month, you don't have any time or the mental energy to say, okay, what does it mean and what do we do with it? So I think Ian said, mentioned something about starting slow, or start somewhere, measure something that's important. I think people need to feel very comfortable that, hey, I can measure these 2, 3, 4 things. They're really those important, integral things to our business, and it's a data set I can get my arms around and make a decision on for now.
Okay, sounds good. Ian?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something there around keeping the list quite short to begin with. I think is a really great point. I think when we started out in this area, we kind of went out to all the different sites. What are all the things we should be measuring, and started to try and do all those, and felt bad if there were 1 or 2 that we couldn't. But then when we started to go through operations reviews and get the rigor around looking at the data and analyzing the data, it soon became clear that you really can't focus on everything, right? You really do need to zero in. And over the years, what we've done is kind of slowly reduce the number of metrics that we look at. And the list is probably the shortest it's ever been now in terms of what we're calling our KPIs. And what that means is that each quarter we are very, very close to every single one of those. And every single one of those really matter to either something that we're trying to do in HR, or to David's point, which I agree entirely with, right? Something that matters to the business. And over time, we found that things like cost and time actually are not what the business cares about. First of all, our cost is centralized, so they're indirectly footing the bill, but not directly, right? And so what they really care about is the quality of the individual coming into the organization. And so being able to talk to them about that and how we've made a difference there is starting to be the number one thing that they care about. But we still have to hold ourselves accountable to finance, to the rest of HR on certain things. And so I think it's important to think about your audience as well. And you might measure certain things for different folks, but keeping that list as short as possible and as targeted as possible, I think, is really important.
I think that's a good point, because we know that with any of the ATSs that I put in over the last 15 years, I mean, we could measure every single step, from CV in to the first interview, second interview, third interview, and measure each person. And you're right, we could be buried under data. But is all of it relevant or not? Mark, you said you might have a question to add to this.
Yes, please. It might be the only thing I get to say today because the quality of what's coming out from these guys is excellent. David mentioned something and then Ian just repeated it about quality of hire. I'm really interested to know how you guys go about measuring quality of hire. You know, give me a couple of scenarios, you know, whether it might be revenue generating people or non-revenue generating people. Talk to me about what you guys do in your processes with your organisations to do that. Would be really interesting.
David, well, why don't you go first on this one?
Okay, so mine's more general advice, I guess, and from what I've seen from a variety of organisations. So I think quality of hire means different things to different people. And as you quite rightly said, Mark, I think it means different things within the same organisation depending on the types of talent that you're talking about. So I think revenue generating, it's quite easy. Quality of hire should be all about the performance of that new hire during their first year, I'd say, in the organisation, and then I think the responsibility moves out of the talent acquisition team into the business as well. And that quality could be, you know, if it's sales, what's their revenue versus the average revenue of a new hire within the business, and I think you can then measure, you know, whether it was a good hire or it's a bad hire. I think with other areas, other maybe non-revenue generating, it's a bit more challenging sometimes, but I guess it would be, you know, things like six month review. Would the hiring manager? You know, the question is, would the hiring manager hire that person again? You know, and I think that probably tells you whether it was a good hire or not. And then you can start looking at performance. You can start looking at, you know, performance reviews. Maybe, you know, promotability at the end of the year. Whether they stay. Now, whether they stay isn't always down to the fact that they're a good hire or not. It may be down to the manager or other things within the business, like the culture. But I think it's pretty fair to say that someone leaves within the first 6 months, then it could be something that's linked to the recruitment process. So again, it's different. I saw some great analysis last week at the conference in Amsterdam, where a consultancy had looked at call center staff, and they'd actually said if someone wasn't performing by month 4, then it was a bad hire because they were never going to be able to perform in the business. So again, I think it's different. I'm sure Anthony and Ian have got some probably very specific examples of both of these.
Before you guys chip in, I'll tell you that was a really good, thorough answer. What about, we talked about, you both mentioned about, or all three of you mentioned about behaviours as well and influencing behaviours. So once we get these statistics out, once we start to determine what makes a good hire, do you guys have things that influence the people working on the coalface in recruitment to try and encourage them to try and make better decisions, or to, you know, select the right people into the business? Ian?
Yeah, sure. So I just reiterate a couple of things that David said there around, I absolutely agree with the on-the-job performance piece. And then we do look at early attrition within the first 6 months. We agree that that's not entirely something that recruitment is on the hook for, that there's a lot of obviously manager decision and then maybe culture in play there as well. Culture tends to come into play kind of the longer an individual maybe is with the organization as well, but it's an indicator that we monitor. Definitely when you have sales performance or something like that, then that's a nice tangible measure. The opinion of the hiring manager as to whether they'd hire again is one as well, although I always find that one is interesting because how many hiring managers are going to admit that they made a mistake as well, and so there's subjectivity there, right? And so I think we do a lot of surveys, right? And I think surveys are great, and we do use them. But I think if you can balance those with the hard data, then you start to get yourself a nice mix of information. The interesting thing that we're going through at the moment that makes this all a little bit difficult for the short term is we've just blown up our entire performance management process. We've gone away from ratings and we're going more to like an always-on feedback kind of tool. And so something with that I'm really excited to see how it pans out and keeping my fingers crossed is that there will be a lot of data coming back from that around regular feedback on performance and engagement, and that we'll be able to tie stuff back to that data. But at the moment we don't have that. So in the past we have used performance rating and things like that, but again, it's not perfect, right? So the quality one is difficult. I would say there isn't one perfect metric. I think it's a combination of all these things start to help you to build a bit of an index. To come back to your question, Mark, around then what do you go and do with it, right? How do you then maybe look at issues where the quality is lower and start to try and fix the problem? I think for the time being, all we've done with that is start to try and isolate around maybe is there something around our selection process, right, or our assessment criteria that is falling down, and that's making, maybe it's the hiring manager interview, or it's something around that process that means we're not making the best decision around the candidate. And so that's something we're trying to look at, is how to make the selection process more robust. So that's something we've done for now, but that's probably about it so far.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Mark, for getting him this way. Anthony, I guess you've got a lot you could say on this, but one thing I want to pose to you as you start to pile in on this is, I mean, you're in the talent acquisition side. How much impact or ability do you have to actually get involved in the quality of hire measure, or is it kind of, you got him in, I'm done?
Well, it's funny you mention that, because I've been trying to jump out of my seat to share my idea of whether it's a quality of hire or not is who takes credit for the hire. If the hiring manager says, "Oh, I hired Jane Doe," then it's a good hire. If they say, "No, recruitment hired Jane Doe," then it's a bad hire. But I agree. I think both of the other speakers had mentioned, some surveys. We do survey our hiring managers. We ask them about the last hire that they made and whether they would make that hire again given the choice. I think one of the limitations to that is we do that pretty soon after that person is hired, and during that sort of honeymoon period for both parties. And I think looking a little bit downwind, within the first year, their performance within the first year, whether they stay with the company for the first year, those types of things I think would be more valuable. And then combining it, as Ian said, with some other hard data. It's not something that I think we're particularly great at, but it's things that we're looking at in different pockets of the company with our sales professionals, with different types of groups on our team. We're trying to figure those types of things out and marrying up that survey data with the hard data of performance reviews or sales effectiveness and things like that. We're also testing a third-party assessment that I think will help us in the long run as well. But I do think that's a very tough metric to look at. One of the things that we're doing with the data that we do have, though, a couple things. I'll take one step back. The other quality data that we look at is what we call quality of the candidate. And without going into too much detail of our entire hiring process, when we are looking at our sourcing effectiveness or our branding effectiveness, we look at the percentage of candidates from a particular activity or source that have made it to the hiring manager interview. So they've gone through their pre-screen, they've gone through a resume review, different assessments, and they've been forwarded to the hiring manager for an interview. Now, we get about 20,000 candidates per month, and we hire about 250 external candidates per month. So there's, out of the 19+ thousand that don't get hired, we're positive there's some really good quality candidates in there. So rather than just look at source of hire or where we're getting our hires from, we're looking at where we're getting those candidates that are forwarded to the hiring manager interview for, and we look at each of our sources or a lot of our activities and say, well, what sources or what activities are the most efficient in bringing us those quality candidates, and then the way that we use that is we use that to inform our sourcing strategy going forward. So we can say, the candidates that seem to be very successful here come from this particular competitor or this particular industry or maybe this particular educational background, this particular degree program, and we can use that to inform the sourcing strategy going forward and influence the hiring manager to say, okay, you're looking for this position. I just filled, over the past year, I've filled 5 of those positions, and 3 of the successful candidates have come from this particular niche, so I'm going to look there first. And sort of prep the hiring manager that's kind of what they're looking for, and we expect that person to be successful.
All right, that's great. I appreciate that. I mean, I guess, guys, we could probably have an entire show just on quality of hire, and probably be for 2 or 3 hours on it. We have had some good comments in from our audience. Charles mentioned that his first thought about measuring quality of hire was how long it took to get him up to speed, but also wondered if maybe if we didn't make sure we had an integrated onboarding that would help with recruitment staying more actively involved through to the person becoming an employee. That might help us assess that. And one comment Andy wants to know, well, we were talking about measuring the quality of hire. What about if we flip that back and look at the quality of the recruiter? Should we have the same metric? To your point, hey, if the hiring manager likes them, I hired them, and if the recruiter, and if we're not so good, maybe the recruiter did. So maybe we need to be measuring the quality of recruiter during that process. I guess one of the things that comes about to me through all of this, though, is, and you all touched on at the beginning, is why does this whole analytics piece matter? And I think, the easy answer is to say, well, because it's for the good of the business. But David, how do we actually make sure that we are measuring stuff that's for the good of the business?
Well, ask the business, I think, would probably be the first one. I think we kind of touched on that at the start. Measure what matters to the business, and again, understand what the business problem is that you can then conduct the analysis on as well. I think that's the key. I think it's easy to get lost in the data otherwise and desperately trying to find some insights. So I think it's very important. We've got recruitment business partners, we've got HR business partners. They need to be close to the business. They need to understand the business area in which they're working in. They need to understand how that business makes money, and then they have a great relationship with their counterparts in the line of business, so they can really understand what are the key challenges that they're facing, and then link that back to wider people issues, but also obviously recruitment as well. So, for example, again, we use sales because sales is an easy one, I think, for people to understand. If you can do some analytics to find out what are the big five biggest predictors of sales success within the organisation, for example, some of those could be things like engagement, some of those could be quality of the manager, but one of those could be, as Anthony was suggesting with his example, that could be down to the source of hire. That could be the background of the candidate before they come into the organisation. So if you can find that, if you can find some of those things, and they do link back to recruiting, for example, then you can kind of re-engineer the recruitment process to try and get more of those people who are going to be your star performers. And that's what analytics can do way above metrics. Metrics just kind of tells you how you're doing. Analytics can kind of give you the insights as to how you could do it better.
Okay, that's great, David. I'm just going to do a quick reset here. You're listening and watching to Rec Hangout, hashtag REC Hangout. We're joined today by Ian Bailie, David Green, and Anthony Scarpino, who are all sort of well noted in the era of people analytics. And we're doing this in conjunction with the People Analytics Conference from London, which is on the 27th, 28th of April at the QE2 Center, hashtag PA16LON. And we've been having some really interesting discussion about how we get from the metrics, the basic data that we gather, into analyzing those in a more business-focused arena. And we've had some great conversations with some of our guests joining in as well. So if you are listening and you want to add some feedback, please do put your questions either in the webinar jam or via the hashtag Rec Hangout, and we'd love to try and get your input into the show. Ian, is how David described getting engaged with the business. Is that how it works for you within Cisco?
Yeah, no, I think David's absolutely right. I do think you need to understand what it is the business cares about and how you can start to link into that, and that will depend, right, for every company. I mean, something that we've seen a lot of traction with recently is starting to, as I said, tying this kind of recruitment to workforce planning piece is if we're looking at where to open up a new office or where to expand our presence globally, is how we can start to influence that decision by understanding the external candidate pools, the market, doing some of that market mapping, and then really starting to come back and help the business and the facilities, workplace resources folks to kind of understand where they'll be better positioned from a candidate perspective, right, from a talent pool perspective. We've had situations where we've been thinking about going into particular locations in China or something like that where all of the other kind of metrics suggest that this is the right place to go, right? Maybe we're looking at it from a real estate cost, all of those different factors. But when you then start to kind of, if you do a high-level view of the candidate pool, then maybe you say, yeah, there's a lot of people who are qualified and could be potential Cisco employees. When we then start to cut the data a bit deeper and understand more about it, then and layer on the criteria that we might have around multinational experience, proficiency in English language, things like that, then there was an occasion where the talent pool just shrank considerably and we changed our mind about which location to go into. And so, that was a huge impact on a decision that we were making at a business level, right? And then in terms of the impact to the recruitment team, to then have to try and hire in that market where maybe there weren't as many candidates as we originally thought would have been incredibly challenging as well. And so I think understanding what matters and how you can tie some of the work that you're doing around analytics into that is critical.
Well, and Mark wonders, Ian, how do we apply the kind of metrics and analytics we're talking about to the more behavioral or cultural assessments? Because that impacts your talent pool as well, doesn't it? And maybe that's important in a Cisco and international business, but it's also going to be important for Anthony and the kind of business that Sodexo is. I mean, can we actually analyze and put analytics into that behavioral and cultural piece?
Yeah, so quickly from my perspective, and I'd love to hear from Anthony on that. From an assessment perspective, we don't have kind of formal selection tests like that around, cultural or behavioral piece at this point. We tend to do scorecards around interviewing and have different processes like that, but we don't put people through, a formal test from that point of view. We tend to rely on the interview process to get at that and put the rigor around the scorecards and things like that. But it is something we're looking at, whether that's something we would look to do more as part of our assessment process.
Yeah, same here. We don't do a lot of that around the behavioral cultural assessment. We have started to look at that with a third-party assessment tool for our sales organization and our sales hires. And some of those hiring managers, as we've tested it on candidates, have decided to go back and test all of their current employees, the current sales professionals, to sort of match up. Okay, I know this person is performing really well and fits in the organization, has that behavioral fit, and do they fit with the, how does that coincide with the candidates that are coming in? I have to admit, me personally, I'm not really sure how much that goes into behavior and culture as much as it does the predictiveness of sales, of success in the sales performance. But I believe it uses the culture and behavioral characteristics of the individual to indicate whether or predict whether they would have that sales success. So I do want to go back to the question you had asked. I believe you had asked David, is what's the value of the analytics and the metrics? And David, I think, was right on spot when he talked about looking at what's important to the business and identifying the importance to the business. I also think there's a value internally in terms of our efficiency and effectiveness of our recruiters. You had touched a little bit on the quality of our recruiter as well as the quality of the candidates. And I think sometimes it's not necessarily, obviously sometimes it is the quality of the recruiter, but I think sometimes it's more the effectiveness and the efficiency of the tools that we give them or the practices that we give them, and how much can these metrics, like when we're talking about common sources of hire or common sources of background, how much can we use data to really help people be the best that they can be, to be the most effective and the most efficient, to find the best candidates as quickly as possible? I had mentioned the big giant number of 20,000 candidates and 200 hires. That's a ton of work. It's a ton of work for our recruiters. So how can we use data to help them weed those 20,000 down to even 100 or 200 or 300 in order to get to that couple of hires? So I do think metrics, although I completely agree, we need to be, HR in general needs to be very focused on what's important to the business. I think the efficiency and effectiveness, which reduces time and presumably will ultimately reduce cost of replacing those people, is important for us to use those metrics in that way as well.
Anthony, could I just ask you a question? You mentioned about that HR and recruiters need to stay focused on what's important to the business, and I've had a number of conversations with CEOs of massive organisations and quizzed them over how close they are to the objectives that are being set to the people on the coalface, because I also meet with a lot of HR people, and I know that they are driven by a different set of metrics: get the job filled as quickly as possible with as minimum fuss. Whereas the business is obsessed with quality. We bring the right people in, the business grows, it flourishes, it maintains its reputation. We deliver against, the client's requirements. Do you see this disconnect in your business? Are you aware and conscious of trying to make sure that the coalface is doing what the business actually wants it to do?
Yeah. Do you remember the book was the book called "Men Are from Mars and Women Are from Venus"? That's about how separate those entities are. I don't think that's always the case, but I do think it's we are tracking and we're motivated by very different factors. And I also think within the operations sector, the segment, it's different depending on the level of the person that you're talking to. I think within any organization, if you talk to the leaders of a particular segment or operation, oftentimes they're looking to develop people and to build their teams and to hire people in for attitude and then train them for the technical skill. But if you bring that down to the hiring manager that needs to fill the position in their particular operating unit, or has that empty seat and they have some objectives, a lot of times what's most important to them is getting that position filled with somebody that has the skill that can quote unquote hit the ground running. So I do think there's a disconnect, not only sometimes between recruitment and operations, but even within the different levels of operations. And I think the more we can, both sides can sort of educate each other on what's important. I think, one of the things that Sodexo has that I think is tremendously valuable is we have a lot of our recruiters have an operations background. I myself spent 10 years in our operations before I moved into recruitment for Sodexo. And although I wouldn't want to tip the scales too far in either direction, I have found that there's a very, very nice balance. When you have a balance between those two backgrounds, your team is much more effective and much more savvy about meeting the needs of the business versus that sort of meeting the needs of HR. And again, there's a balance. I think there's also some a lot of value into having people that have that hardcore recruitment background and having them on the team as well. But the operations background has helped us a great deal.
So does that mean that we could have a metric or an analytic, either or, that measures the effectiveness of recruiters and their background? But I'll also throw into the mix, and I've been on Webinar Jam going back and forth to Charles Britton on this one, what about also measuring that the hiring manager, and not on how they do their day job, but obviously we don't necessarily want to get into that, but measuring them and their impact on this hiring process or hiring experience that we're in. Is that an area of this sort of people analytics, David, that we should be getting into? Oh, no, if you want to go first, Anthony, go ahead.
I just want to, just one point on that. I don't have a lot on that, but there was a recent survey done by the Corporate Executive Board, and one of the things that they measured, which I thought was a really interesting measure, is they measured by survey, so it was self-reported, but they measured the confidence that the hiring manager had in making the hiring decision. So it wasn't necessarily did they make a good hiring decision or not, but once they got to that point, were they confident in making that hiring decision? And I think that's a very interesting point, because it not only looks at how how their interview process and their interview skills were, and how well they know the candidate, but did the recruiter equip them and go through the process, and do they have the faith in the process that they ultimately arrived at the right person when they made that decision? I think that's an interesting metric.
All right. David?
Well, I completely agree with that one, and that's a good insight from the Corporate Executive Board there. But I suppose if you think about it, data and insight are helpful for the recruiter, they're helpful for the hiring manager as well. And I know organisations who won't let their hiring managers actually interview unless they've been through a training course effectively on how to interview, which probably is common sense in some respects, particularly if they're not hiring that many people a year. But maybe the roles they're hiring are really key roles. I think, again, if you're a recruiter as well, I think there's one thing you said about insight. So let's say you're hiring, 200 people a year, and you found out that the people that were hired and the people that were successful were the one that you had a far more personal touch with, the candidates that you actually spoke to on the phone just before their final interview, rather than sending them an email just checking they were turning up. I guess those sorts of insights can help improve recruiter behaviour and help recruiters understand what makes them successful, and helps them hire great people. I think that's the sort of thing that data can do, rather than just telling them how many people they've hired, how many people they got their conversion rates and everything else. Do they actually get feedback a year later to find out how many of the people they hired are still in the business? I don't know. Those are the sorts of things, I guess, which are really helpful.
All right, thanks. And Ian, you had a comment you thought you might make about the quality of recruiters or the quality of hiring managers. Which side is it, or are we all in the same loop?
We're on the same loop, but no, it was more about the recruiter side. So it was just kind of talking a bit around kind of the way that we've tried to engineer our KPIs is that they're obviously directly tied up to our strategy for a recruitment organization, and our strategy should be directly tied to obviously what the business is trying to achieve too. And so if you get your KPIs right and you get that flow right, then in theory, you should be measuring the things that are important to you as an organization, as as the TA organization, your effectiveness, satisfaction of your customer, things like that. But then also the direct result to the business, such as things we've talked about quality. So that was kind of number one. The second point attached to that is that we make a point of tying all of those KPIs all the way down to the recruiter level. So a recruiter will get a scorecard that will show them how they perform against all of those metrics, for themselves, and that will include things like quality and early attrition and things like that. But not only that, we also pay them based on that data, and we do directly tie their performance to those KPIs, and their pay for performance, right? And so we have a new scheme that is directly linking their bonus to their performance against those KPIs, and I think that's really important in terms of making sure that the team focus in on what's important. And I think before we had that, we maybe got that data down to a team level, but getting it down to the individual level was a lot harder. So that was kind of one overall point. And then the other thing that I wanted to just add was there's a lot of research out there around how you can drive the effectiveness of a recruitment organization, and it always comes down to data and credibility, and giving the recruiters the right data and putting it into their hands in order for them to build credibility with the business. And I think them enabling the recruiters to drive a great relationship with the hiring manager, to really build that communication, that partnership, is so much easier if they have good data at their fingertips. And so if you're starting to build that muscle within your recruitment team of them looking at the data, understanding the data, that could be internal effectiveness data, but also the external candidate pools, and being able to talk knowledgeably about that, then there's a lot of research that shows that direct correlation between all of that piece and the hiring managers being a lot happier with the service they're getting. And we've seen that ourselves. We saw that the biggest driver from all of our hiring manager surveys in terms of overall hiring manager sat was around clear and timely communications and being able to speak knowledgeably about the process and understanding the business, right? And so I think that's where data's really helped us to both kind of make the recruiters more successful, but also obviously overall drive a more successful organization.
Brilliant. So I'm glad that you got KPIs that someone's getting rewarded on their performance. Now, do they get a bonus if they save money on the cost per hire?
Well, cost per hire is an interesting one because they don't directly control it. So the cost per hire is very much managed at a much higher level. So cost is one that we do not tie down to the recruiters because they have very little control over that. Yeah.
Right. So you should get bonus on saving costs then.
Exactly. There you go. Yeah. No, I should get bonus on us making great hires. There
you go. All right. Guys, we've got about 15 minutes to 10, 12 minutes to go. Final reset. This is Rec Hangout with the stars of People Analytics and the People Analytics London show, which is coming up the 27th, 28th of April. We got David Green, Ian Bailie, and Anthony Scarpino, all giving us the benefit of their knowledge. Guys, the last sort of piece of this, we've talked a lot about what metrics are, what we could be measuring, what analytics is, its value to the business. How do I get started on this? I'm out there and I've got a pile of metrics. Maybe as my ATS has given me some good information. How the heck do I get started on moving from just having some metrics into doing analytics? Is there a roadmap? Do I have a business plan? And who starts that? Is that like HRD or global head of talent? Where does that start and how do I get going? Anthony?
Well, I guess we're going to start with me. Well, I think there's a lot of questions there, right? I think there's a lot of questions there. I think to answer your last one first, I would say let it start with me. I think if you're looking to improve a process, to measure the effectiveness of the process, why shouldn't it start in talent acquisition or HR, depending on how you're organized? And you certainly, depending on what you end up measuring in the long run, I think you may involve different groups and different departments that that participate in that. But I do think getting started, why not look at yourself and say, what can I measure? What can I look at and interpret to help the process get better? Now, where do you start with that? It really depends on the organization and the capabilities that you have in your organization. In some cases, if you're an organization, maybe some of the smaller to mid-sized organizations that look to having an entire HR suite, so or technology suite. So the same company that is managing your HR process and your ATS is also your HR database, and your payroll database, and your performance your performance evaluation database. When you have those all together, I have to admit I've never had the luxury of that, but my assumption is when you have those all together, they speak to each other, and you can sort of marry up that data a little bit more readily. I think in other organizations, or especially particularly in large organizations like Sodexo, you tend to not necessarily purchase the entire suite, but you look for the sort of best in class for each individual entity. And the plus side of that is you get a wonderful program for your ATS, you get a wonderful system for your HR database, you get a wonderful system for your benefits and your payroll and your performance evals. But one of the downsides is they don't necessarily talk to each other as readily. So I think the hard part for us when we talk about, I think Ian had mentioned several times, workforce planning and marrying up some of the metrics and the analytics that we've talked about on the talent acquisition side with the metrics and the analytics on the on sort of performance management, sales effectiveness, those types of things. The tough part for us is how do you get those systems to talk to each other so it's not a very manual process. So, depending on where your organization is on that and what the technical capabilities are, I think it really will vary where you get started. But I think going back to almost the very first comment we talked about is it doesn't have to. You don't have to recreate the world. You start with a very small data set, a couple of things that are very important to you, a couple of the story that you want to tell to the business, and try to put those data points together, analyze them, make some good decisions, and take some action on them.
David, some of the comments that came out of thank you for that, Anthony. David, some of the comments that came out of your Amsterdam conference that you were at was also about, maybe I need to build a business case to even start doing analytics, or, I need to find that, even as Anthony said, a small piece somewhere in the business where I can see this is going to be important, so that I can actually go ahead and maybe build a research hypothesis. I can then build a case, and then I can figure out where am I going to go find all this stuff. Is there a template for that? How do I even do that?
Well, my favorite quote that came out of the Amsterdam conference, it's time for HR to stop talking about this and actually start doing it, which I thought was probably the most succinct comment, probably the best one of the whole 2 days. Getting started isn't easy. Technology is only an enabler to this. It's not the answer. And yes, as Anthony described, you can go down the single suite route. You can go down the best of breed route. Whatever it is, you need to make sure that the data that goes into those systems is good and clean, so you can actually use it when it comes out. And there are ways of integrating some of the best of breed systems together now, so you can actually get some clean data coming out as well. I think analytics should be owned by the CHRO, personally. Because I think then you're more likely to move forward with it. I think the challenges that you've got is traditionally, I had another great analogy. Analytics is not reporting, and the skills needed to do both are different. And the best analogy I heard from a prominent head of a people analytics team, global head of people analytics team, was you wouldn't ask a nurse to do a doctor's job. And you wouldn't ask a doctor to do a nurse's job. So I think there are different skills that you need definitely to do it. In terms of getting started, I think it's back to what we were talking about earlier. It's really start what are the business problems? So there's an example there I think Ian gave around where Cisco are thinking, okay, where are we going to hire these new people in? And his team's been able to provide insight as to the demand and the supply statistics of the external marketplace to help pinpoint where is the best location to hire those people. I think that's a sort of business conversation then that the recruitment business part can really having the business and really adding value, and that's what it's all about at the end of the day. So you don't have to have perfect data. I think there is a misnomer out there that you do, but obviously you need to be confident enough in your data that when you're challenged on it, when you give the insights, you can defend it. And I think probably, I don't know what Ian thinks and Anthony think. I think it's probably the 80-20 rule. There are organisations I know out there who have started, sorting out their reporting and metrics, but they've also gone to the business and say, would you like to understand, I don't know, again, that's used to sales. What are the biggest indicators of sales performance within your business? Well, of course, the answer they're going to give is yes. And then the power is when you combine the HR and the recruiting data with the business data as well, and then you can start to get some real insights out and make real change.
All right, thanks, David. Ian, you know, we've very carefully, David's pretty much answered it on your behalf. But just as a quick one of the other comments from Charles Britton is, do we also have to maybe learn to speak the language that the CEO speaks if you're going to try and, you know, bring this to the business and have the business benefit? And that's not necessarily the easiest thing for someone in HR or talent to do, is it?
Yeah, no, that's true. I think it's about understanding, coming back to the, you know, it's a common theme that's emerging here, right? It's what matters to the business, right? You've got to ask why. Why are you measuring these things, right? And you've got to be able to make sure that that it's something you can then take action from. I think recruiters and you know, HR people being able to speak knowledgeably about their own expertise, right, their own SME kind of area, and use data to build credibility with that is really important. But then to also understand the perspective of the business and the problem that the business is trying to solve is also just as important, right? So I think it's a balance of both. You have to be able to get the problems that the business is facing. You have to be able to speak their language, right? Understand the financial implications of what you're doing, things like that. But then ultimately build credibility and add value, right? It's that simple. And so I liked David's point earlier, right, around stop talking about it, right, and just get on, do it. Get an analyst, get a problem you're trying to solve, and just start looking at the data. And the rest will come. It really will. If you start to put intelligent insights in front of the business, they're going to ask you for 20 more. And so I really do think that's how you kind of get going with this, is just start somewhere, and you'll soon realize that it's just starting to snowball because they want more and more from you.
That may not be a good thing. All right, finally, guys, we're close to the end. What I'd like each of you to do is to think on this. We've talked about all these great reasons why we should do this, some ways to get going on it, what the impact can be. What happens to me if I just don't bother? If I can't be bothered to do good analytics, what happens? Ian, you're still alive? Go ahead.
Well, not much, right? So that's the problem. So I think in order to drive things forward, then you've got to be looking at the data, and you've got to be figuring out how to solve those problems, right? So that's what I would say.
All right, thanks, Anthony.
Yeah, I agree with Ian, and I also think, you know, you just end up not being competitive in the talent market. I think, you know, if you continue to do nothing, everybody else is doing something, you're going to be left behind.
All right, perfect. David?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think at the moment, probably somewhere between two or three out of every 10 organisations are actually doing analytics within HR and recruiting. You know, that number is increasing. And there is a danger of being left behind, and if you don't do analytics, you might find yourself being replaced by someone who will, which sounds like quite harsh, but I think that's probably likely to happen.
Brilliant. All right, guys, I appreciate it. As I said before, I'm sure we could go on for another couple hours here, but I appreciate all of your input. This has been a terrific hangout. We've had some good comments from our guests, from Charles, Audrey, Andy, Catherine, and others on the guest side. Really appreciate it. Mark, thanks for your input today. I know we're running up on that 2 o'clock, and Louise is heading out to take a call and maybe go make some money. And appreciate you guys getting, Anthony, particularly getting up early. Good thing it's only 4-hour difference this week. You know, it gave you and Audrey and I a break. You didn't have to get up before breakfast. Louis, I think our next show we're going to talk about PSLs. Good, bad, or indifferent? Are they approved supplier list? Are they preferred supplier list? And do they actually really matter? You guys may want to log back into that one and give us some input. Back to you, Louis.
Well, yes, yeah, fantastic show. Really, really interesting. I certainly, learn a lot myself. We're only a small company here, but there's plenty I think small companies can learn from as well. So thank you very much, guys, for taking your time. And just a reminder for anyone that is watching that you can get that discount code that they've very kindly offered us for the People Analytics Conference in April. And David and Ian, I believe, will both be there as well. So you can sort of harass them for any other questions and insights you want. And all of our guests are on Twitter as well, and I've shared their Twitter profiles, so I'm sure you won't mind them following you guys. The next Rec Hangout is on PSLs, as Alan mentioned. We don't have a date for that yet, but we will email everyone who's registered, as you're now on the Rec Hangout list, and we'll let you know. We'll let you know what's coming up. Maybe you're interested. So it'll be great to have you back again. But yeah, thank you all, and Alan, thank you for doing a good job, and Mark as well. Some great questions. I think we'll call that a wrap then.
All right, that's a wrap.
Everybody.
Take
Thanks.
care.
Thanks.